There we go. All right. So Windswept was our choice for this book this year for this book club, and by Mary Ellen Chase. And hold on, I'm trying to get the slideshow to start from the beginning. There we go. And it was great. I was looking through a bunch of options for books to choose for this fall, and I sent out, most of you will know, a survey asking for some feedback, knowing that Windswept itself doesn't totally, actually doesn't at all, take place on MDI, although MDI is referenced many times. The purpose of the book club when we started it was to read authors based on MDI or books written about MDI, and then be able to place what was happening or the author's life within the larger context of the island and the island's history. And so Windswept kind of pushed us out a little bit from that sort of narrow definition of MDI, but I feel really confident that we're going to be able to pull together a very island-centric conversation this evening and a Down East-centric conversation this evening, once we sort of dig into some of the topics that she covers, which are very universal to Down East Maine, and also her life, which we'll sort of start with a little bit of a background on Mary Ellen Chase herself. Now that I have the recording going, I can't see you guys. So if you want to ask a question or clarification or make a comment, please don't hesitate to do that. Just pipe up, because I won't be able to see you if you try to raise your hand or anything. So Windswept was written by Mary Ellen Chase. She was born in February on the 24th in 1887 in Blue Hill. And she died in 1973 in Massachusetts. And so she had a very long and full and fulfilling life. But her time in Maine in her childhood through earning her bachelor's degree in college, really was the foundation for her sense of identity and the kinds of things that she wanted to express as an author and a writer. She wrote works of fiction and nonfiction. And she was a very prolific lecturer, and she even wrote a few textbooks. So her kind of identity as someone from Maine was central to her works of fiction and of nonfiction biography. She was one of several children. Her father was an attorney and had a reputation for being incredibly strict and very disciplined. And her mother was a homemaker who encouraged in her children a love of reading and playing word games, which was something that really developed in Mary Ellen Chase's life. She loved language and words, which is not surprising when you read Windswept and how, sort of poetic she has a tendency to really focus on the use of language and poetry to express how she feels about land and place. And so you can really see that early childhood focus on language and words. And then her grandmother, her father's mother, lived with the family for years and years. And she had been the wife of a sea captain. And she told Mary Ellen Chase and her siblings all these different stories about her 10 years of her time living on the sea with her captain husband. And so she traveled all over the world and experienced all sorts of different locations and cultures, and really made sure to tell the kids a lot about her life. She grew up in this house in Blue Hill, which is now on the National Register of Historic Properties. It's a 2.5-story Greek Revival building that was built in 1842. In 1860, her father, Captain Chase, her grandfather, Captain Chase, he was, like I said, prominent in travel and was going all over the world as a ship captain and businessman. And so he purchased this house in 1860 for $1,600. And he met his future wife, Eliza Ann Westcott, at his own memorial service. It had been rumored that he had died at sea, and that they held a funeral service for him in the community, and he showed up to his own funeral, and there he met his wife. So they thought he had died at a shipwreck near Ireland, but he clearly did not. So he and Eliza ended up building a ship together called the Bride, which crashed. and had a shipwreck like a couple months out at sea on its first maiden voyage. He tied her to the mast to save her, to make sure that she wouldn't be lost with the tossing of the ship. She was saved. They come back to shore. They had to build a new ship, and then ended up embarking on that and spending the next 10 years traveling the globe together. By the time he buys this house in 1860, he had already retired from active life at sea, but he continued to own and operate many different ships, as an owner and a businessman. He died in 1884, and his son Edward inherited the home, and that Edward is Mary Ellen's father. And so he raised his children in this home as well. So here's Mary Ellen's family and her mother and father. Her father, Edward, had attended Hallowell Classical Institute and Bowdoin College, and he graduated and became an attorney for many different towns within Hancock County. He went on to marry Edith Label Lord, and the couple lived in this house with his mother and their 8 children. And they were there between 1885 and 1912. The property was quite extensive. It had a number of acres, and on the acreage included an orchard with dozens of trees behind the house, a lavish flower garden, and a large barn that held the family cow, horses, pony, and a donkey. Mary Ellen wrote a lot about her childhood and growing up in this house, and it was the scene of many of her well-written books, including the 1954 novel, The White Gate, which detailed her grandparents' journey, and many of her other books, including A Walk on an Iceberg, also feature, again, that mix of her grandparents' seafaring life and then growing up in this small community in Blue Hill, Maine, really grounded in this house that had been, she's the 3rd generation, essentially, to live in this house. It remained in her family for 3 generations until 1968. Mary Ellen attended school in Blue Hill, where she learned Latin and Greek, and her father encouraged her to attend a teacher's college and pursue her degree in education, which she did. After she graduated from the Blue Hill Academy, she went to the University of Maine in Orono, where she earned her BA in teaching and graduated in 1909. When she was 19 years old, she took over the position of a school marm at a one-room schoolhouse in Bucks Harbor, Maine. Her father felt like it was a really important part of her maturity to be able to get out, even at a very young age, before she even finished college, to get out and try her hand at teaching, believing that it would really kind of put a fast track on her maturity and help her with her intellectual discipline that she would need to continue on both as a teacher and as a scholar. After she graduated from the University of Maine, she was in touch with an agency that placed teachers in the West. And this agency was located in Chicago. And so she applied for teaching jobs further out in West, and she landed her first job outside of Maine at a co-educational boarding school in Wisconsin, where she taught for a little while before moving to a private girls' school in Chicago. But while she was there, she got really sick with some sort of, I don't know that it was tuberculosis, but something that was deeply affecting her lungs, and her overall kind of robust health and constitution was being affected by the sort of dampness of the Chicago seasons. And so it was advised to her by a doctor that she needed to move out west where the climate was drier. And so she moved to Montana to be able to recuperate and rebuild her strength, where she also was a teacher. And so you end up, if you do a search on Mary Ellen Chase, there are a number of photographs of her on horseback. Some of her early writings take place in Western settings and in Montana. And it was for this reason, because she was out there for a little while, regaining her strength and the health of her lung capacity, working there. So she stayed in Montana for a little while. It's hard to find exact dates of sort of these early years of her teaching. It sounds like she really did move quite a bit from year to year. but eventually she ends up leaving Montana and going to Minnesota to continue her education, where she receives a PhD from the University of Minnesota. And she teaches there for a little while until she's hired by Smith College in 1926. So she's moved around quite a bit, from graduating in Orono in 1909 to then finally coming back to the East Coast in 1926 to teach at Smith College. And she taught there, specifically courses in English. She wrote the textbooks from which she taught, and a couple of other textbooks that were used widely in college campuses on English, the use of language, writing, and then also she taught classes on interpretation and understanding of the King James Version of the Bible, which she also wrote and lectured about extensively throughout her career. She published over 30 different books, ranging from fiction to biography to critical biblical scholarship, and many of her fiction works were set in Maine and heavily influenced by the life of her seafaring grandparents, rural values, and the cultural shifts that she observed taking place here over the periods of time where she writes. She spent the majority of her career teaching English and writing at Smith College, but she was a very prolific lecturer, and she was engaged all over the country, traveling to give lectures primarily related to the Bible, but also about her biography and about writing in general. She is described as being an incredibly passionate and kind and engaging lecturer, very welcoming to people of all ages who wanted to learn more, especially about her interpretation of the Bible. And this earned her a number of honorary degrees. She was the first woman to be awarded an honorary degree from Northeastern in 1948, but she also received additional honorary degrees from the University of Maine, Bowdoin College, Colby College, and Smith College. In 1956, the Women's National Book Association awarded her the Constance Lindsay Skinner Award. During all of her life, she was identified with the rural Maine seacoast and the seafaring life that she had known as a child. She spent her summers here in Maine as an adult on the property that inspired the book Windswept. And she came to MDI many times. When I looked up her name in our local newspapers, she was often cited in Northeast Harbor and Bar Harbor, and actually all over the island, in people's homes. You know, the social pages would have a little blurb that Mary Ellen Chase was here and she was having tea or dinner or staying with various people on the island. But also there are a lot of lectures that she gave here on the island over the course of her life. And so she knew MDI very well and had deep associations with the island and the people who were here. And whereas Ruth Moore talks about feeling sort of diminished as being kind of categorized as a place-based author or a regional author, she felt like her books, even though they were very grounded in a certain sense of place on MDI or Gott's Island, she felt like her books were universally appealing and that their themes could draw interest from anyone. Mary Ellen Chase felt that she was really proud to be known as a regional author, and that she felt it was her novels were novels of place. And so she was really kind of at the opposite end of the spectrum for that from where Ruth Moore was. She had a lifelong companion, Eleanor Duckett. They met as soon as she moved to Smith College in 1926. Eleanor Duckett was there and was a scholar of medieval history and a prolific author and lecturer as well. And so they lived together in Northampton until her death in the 1970s. Now, if you go to Smith College, there are actually 2 adjoining residence halls that have their names, Chase and Duckett. And they're in honor of this lifelong relationship that the couple had and their contributions to Smith College. They came and summered here on MDI, not on MDI, but here in Maine and at Windswept, where they were able to enjoy a quiet retreat at the property to be able to research and write and walk and reflect and spend a relaxing summer together. They're buried on the property together. So that's a little bit about Mary Ellen Chase. And then we're going to dig in a little bit to Windswept itself and the book. I did not know this, but Windswept is based on a property called Windswept, which has the house as described in such beautiful detail in her book. The book was published in 1941, soon after she had purchased the property. And it hit the New York Times bestselling list within 6 weeks of being published. And it was in its 50th reprinting by 1952. So it was an incredibly popular book at the time. She purchased the property, Windswept, near the end of the world, it was described, between wild blueberry barrens and the ocean on Petite Manan Point in Steuben, Maine in 1940. And she wrote 9 of her books at this property. The house was built in the 1920s and is a simple cottage, classic in the Maine style, with low shingle and simple shutters, and many small paned windows that let the light in from the sea. There is a big room with a fieldstone fireplace that anchors the 2 wings of the house. You can see the fireplace chimney here toward the back of the house. It has 1 kitchen with the other bedrooms on either side, forming the sheltered courtyard at the entrance to the house. Windswept is now on the National Register of Historic Places, and its nomination read, quote, "She is considered by many literary critics to be second only to Sarah Orne Jewett in her ability to capture the history and particular atmosphere of the coast of Maine and its people. The isolated cottage provided Miss Chase with the tranquility and isolation she needed to write, and in turn, it also provided the inspiration for the setting of Windswept, her best-selling novel about immigration and integration in old settled Maine communities." So I'm going to dig into a little bit of the themes that we find in Windswept, and then we're going to have a chance to open that up together for wider conversation. But I'll give a little bit of context to kind of how I think each of these fit with our local area history. And obviously there are many other kinds of themes that we could touch on in the book, but really what stood out for me was obviously immigration was a huge theme. 2 of our main characters, or at least one of the prominent characters, is an immigrant in Jan's character. We have this sort of presence of summer residents versus year-round residents, whereas we sometimes think about that as a form of tension or conflict that can be found on MDI or in other coastal Maine communities. She doesn't really delve into that in this community related to where she is at the property of Windswept. But she does talk a lot about the development on the coast of Maine and sort of has some opinions about the good and bad ways that things can be developed. She talks about the choices of her characters to stay away from Bar Harbor and sort of the busyness of MDI in general and its development, which the book starts in the 1880s. And so at that point, it's sort of Bar Harbor's heyday of the Gilded Age. And she's definitely making a very intentional literary choice to separate the experience of her characters from what might be experienced in Bar Harbor at the time, at the start of the novel. She talks about war and the impact that war will have on families and on broader politics. She talks about political change, family, and a connection to a sense of place. So there's a great review that's taped into the back of our copy here at the Historical Society from Bess Jones that says, quote, "While there is much to admire, it is perhaps unkind to complain that Miss Chase has somehow stopped short of a major achievement. High-mindedness and serene acceptance of what comes results in a kind of monotone of gentility. Ugliness slides to the side easily out of sight. Too much of the drama inherent in any family saga takes place offstage. You long for clashes, rebellion, for downright human crudiness. You come away very proud to have dined among the angels, yet with the teasing, perhaps ignoble wish that a thoroughly nasty little imp had sat next to you at the table." So while she deals with these really, really difficult topics, as this reviewer points out, they kind of happen to the side. So I'm going to give a little bit more context to what was going on along the sidelines in Windswept. And the first relates to immigration. So Windswept chronicles a time in Maine that was really infused with anti-Catholic and anti-immigration extremism. And it starts with these really two extreme examples of actually targeted violence against Catholic influence in the state of Maine in the 1850s. And then her book sort of culminates in the rise of the Ku Klux Klan in the 1920s, is really when we see the height of Klan activity here in the state. In 1920, there's almost 4,000 immigrants that arrived from Poland. That really complements a long list of other European countries that had massive amounts of immigration coming over to the United States. And at that time, membership in the KKK in Maine begins to skyrocket. So in 1920, the Klan membership in Maine is almost zero. It reaches its peak in 1925 of over 150,000 members of the Klan. But by 1930, it only has 225 members. So there's this very fast sort of bell curve that happens here in the state. At its peak in 1925, 23% of Mainers belong to the Klan. So this starts in Maine with something called the Know Nothing Party. And this launches nationally in the 1850s. And it's called this because if anyone asked about their activities and you were involved in the party, you would say, I know nothing. So that was sort of their answer to stay out of the public eye. And then as a result, they ended up being called the Know Nothing Party. And it formed to protect specifically Protestants from the threat of Catholics, who they believed were threatening their religious liberty in the United States. The efforts here in the Northeast were focused against Irish and German Catholics, who they argued could not be loyal to the United States because they were controlled by the Pope in Rome. National immigration trends were seen to a lesser degree in Maine, but because of the relatively small population, here the effect of immigration was very noticeable. And Catholic immigrants, specifically, in addition to sort of being accused of being loyal to Rome, were also noted as targets for hate because they built their own churches and they built their own schools, and they generally wanted to use their own Bibles. And so they wanted to maintain these distinct linguistic and cultural traditions that define their communities. And especially French Catholics in Maine were living in their own enclaves with their own education systems and their own churches and their own languages, working in a lot of times the mills. So working among Maine Protestants. And so that tension that existed really started to take hold in the 1950s. And so this party, the Know Nothing Party, claimed responsibility for two violent acts that took place in the state of Maine. One was in Ellsworth, where a priest was tarred and feathered and chased from town because he denounced public schools for forcing Catholic students to use the Protestant Bible. And the second, pictured here on the left, is the burning of the Old South Church in Bath in 1854. And this is a church that had been built and then it was attacked by a mob and burned, and the congregation was chased away and beaten. And when they returned to try to rebuild the church, the same thing happened. They were chased away again a second time. And so this is sort of happening in small degrees in various parts of Maine, up through the 1850s, 60s, and 70s. And so then as you get increased immigration related to World War I and related to the suppression of labor and unionization in Europe, also brings a large influx of immigration, especially from Eastern Europe. And so this rise in the KKK starts again with the same sorts of concerns about the influence of Catholicism and immigration on Maine Protestant communities. And so with the Klan affiliation specifically, the National Klan organization was in sort of its second it has like 3 cycles, and it's in its second cycle in the 1920s. Its first cycle comes post-World Civil War. It's very focused on violence and repression of Blacks who are trying to assert new rights given to them or won from them related to the fall of the Civil War and the close of the Civil War. And so then we see that sort of ebb, that violence in the South ebbs with Jim Crow laws and a successful tamping down and repression of African-American rights in the South. But that doesn't really take place in the North so much. But when the second coming of the Klan starts to take place in the 20s, they have a very different approach to how they're talking about hate and segregation and racism. It's very different, and it's much more like a fraternal order where they adopt their different sort of iconic clothing and symbology, which feels to Mainers a lot like fraternal orders, which were very, very common in Maine, you know, through Grange halls and through different kinds of like Elks clubs. And there were a lot of these traditions of sort of clubs that already existed in Maine. And so when the Klan came in and presented themselves in a similar way, it was very familiar to Mainers. It didn't feel threatening or strange. And the Klan was very clever about how they crafted their message. They were not against anyone. They were for the protection of Protestants. They were for the Constitution. They were for law enforcement. They weren't against Catholics. They just were for Protestants. And so in that shift of language, it became very insidious to determine, like it was very intentional and very difficult to determine sort of where that line of hate lie. And we saw in Trenton, actually, in 1925, at the peak of the Klan, gathering for a quote unquote clam bake with the election of Governor Brewer. And we had 4,000 people, Klan members in Trenton, with burning flags or burning crosses, excuse me, the cloaks and hoods. There was a cross burning in Northeast Harbor. We had the first daytime parade of the Klan in the state of Maine in Milo during this window of time. So, so lots and lots of activity, and it's all related to immigration here in the state. So Mary Ellen Chase chooses to set a portion of her novel in this time period and also invite characters that will share this perspective and maybe contradict some stereotypes that were being portrayed at the time. I didn't read anything about this, but sort of thinking about it and reflecting, especially related to the characters of Jan and Anton, she really looks at sort of 2 stereotypes between these 2 immigrants. One, in Jan, is the good, hardworking immigrant who's accepted, but at a distance, right? Like, so he's sort of always distant from community members. He's a little bit, they're a little bit suspicious of him. They're a little bit nervous, but they still accept him because he's hardworking and he's honest and he's trustworthy. And so he's allowed to stay in these communities. Whereas in the character of Anton, we have someone who is sort of maybe a little naive, who gets swept up into criminal activity from a pier in New York City. He gets caught and sent to jail. But Chase never brings any sort of accountability or reckoning for that behavior into the book. Anton is held accountable by going to jail, but he never is held to account in his relationship with Jan. And so she sort of leaves him in this, again, othered position where we don't have to hold him accountable because by the time he gets out of jail, his mental health has deteriorated such that he's more of a child. And so he's not held responsible or doesn't have to have like a kind of a confrontation or a reconciliation with Jan as a result. So I thought that was sort of interesting way to present these 2 different immigrant characters that she brings to the book. Windswept in general has a somewhat romantic view of how well immigrants were integrated into rural Maine life. As you see, it was not totally as accepting as she makes it sound for Jan and Anton. She has really brief references to Catholicism. She does certainly make clear that Jan and Anton would be Catholics, and that there were other Catholics that they were able to meet up with to be able to attend services. But overall, through hard work and upstanding morals, they end up being accepted, the larger immigrant community. So she clearly values the contributions that immigrants were making to American life and tries to make the case for that in her book. And apart from Anton's criminal activity, the references to immigrants are overwhelmingly positive. She's got strong contributions. And when you look at when Jan goes down to Connecticut to visit the Polish farm where he sees Anton, the depictions of that farm are in both cases very positive. Mm-hmm. So the next theme that we're going to talk briefly about is the summer versus year-round kind of culture that she brings to the book. She notes at the beginning of the book in her author's note that this location could be anywhere on any coastal property in down East Maine, but she specifically says it's east of Acadia and Bar Harbor, and that this is important to her for both the distinctions in the natural landscape and the cultural landscape, which are reoccurring themes throughout the whole book. In terms of the cultural differences that she talks about, in addition to that author's note that I just mentioned, she includes observations from her characters as to why they selected such an isolated location, away from the busy and more socially stratified glitz of Bar Harbor. These characters, when they're not in Maine, are on the fringes of Boston society as well. They're part of it, but reluctantly so, and not embracing it to the same degree that they might or that their peers might. And so that is reflected in their choice of where they want to spend time in Maine as well, where they're seeking to isolate themselves from sort of the social stratification and networks that might have reestablished themselves from Boston onto MDI for those summer months. So specifically, two of the characters, John and Julian, go through a little exchange of criticism about the culture of MDI. And they specifically, if you had a chance to read it and notice it, they talk about garden clubs and the fact that they felt that garden clubs fooled women into thinking that they were getting back to nature. Mm-hmm. And John sums up his feelings for MDI as such. I'm not strong for garden clubs myself, but we're not bothered with them much anyway down here. They flourish in Bar Harbor and places like it. There are too many such places on this coast to suit me. Mount Desert Island from the headland here is the way it ought to be. So the other piece culturally about Windswept is that it also puts them in regular contact with year-round residents in a way that they might not have had if they were on MDI or specifically in Bar Harbor. And this allows Chase to explore the connections that might be had between summer residents and year-round locals, both similarities in values and also differences, which may be reflective of the time that she spent summering on the property at Windswept. The two locals who play the most, the strongest role or have the strongest influence in the book are Mrs. Haskell and Caleb Perkins. The rest of the locals are sort of like a homogenous single entity that are present for a little local color, but they don't offer any real contributions or dialogue or personality to the story. But Caleb and Mrs. Haskell do capture the charm and native intelligence born of the land and from rural living, which Chase clearly values, not only in her personal life, but in her writings. So when you look at specifically Mrs. Haskell's turn of phrase, she's oftentimes quite humorous, and she is very insightful. She really is shown to be quite intelligent, even though her wisdom and humor and sort of strict sense of order and cleanliness might be comic relief in some ways to the book. They're also a credit to her. And I wondered if this was another way of sort of countering stereotypes that Mary Ellen Chase might have been trying to offer a different perspective of what a rural, down east, year-round local resident could, might have looked like with their humor and their sort of sense of order and strict understanding of the way that life should be managed. So the Marston family, who are the main characters throughout the book, are mostly summer residents. And so it's interesting the way that Chase allows them to sort of establish their connection to place as though they were year-round residents. Oftentimes you sort of forget that other than Jan, they're not there throughout the full year, because they have this rich sense of place that makes, I felt like, transported you to that spot all the time. It kind of was so rooted in place that you forget that they weren't always present on the property, even though through Jan, we get a little bit of a sense for what it was like year round. But ultimately, it's that allure of place that grounds this family to the house, and does eventually create some sense of a year-round connection to Windswept. Which takes us to sort of the other reason for setting the book in down East Maine, away from MDI, and that is the natural landscape and how different it is from MDI. This is an aerial view of Windswept, the house, and where it's located along the coastline there. So you can get a real sense for where she talks about the cove where the sailboat would be, and the beach and the cliffs, and how, you know, steep that one cliff would be and how dangerous it could be in the fog, but also how exposed the property is. When she starts Windswept in the 1880s, MDI would have been primarily cleared of trees. It would have not had nearly as much forest land as is present today. So it also would have been quite open to the elements. But she does spend quite a bit of time, especially at the beginning of the book, really establishing this sense of place as being very, very different from other locations that people might have known or assumed about the coast of Maine. She clearly loved this place and the wilds of its weather, and she wanted her readers to understand it and love it the same way that she did. And so through her descriptions of place, she really requires us to understand an intimate and personal relationship with the land and the sea. Her characters have that for sure. They farm, harvest, hunt, explore, swim, sail, and cherish all aspects of this property. The construction of the little chapel that she mentions, I felt seemed less to do with religious services and more as another way to capture the sacred nature of the sense of place, because they spend more time in the chapel, especially the son, just enjoying the quiet of the chapel versus in service. And so it seemed like it was an extension of the natural place. And so here on MDI, we had, you know, sort of 1880s to 1920s rusticators priding themselves on a lifestyle that rejected many modern inventions. And for a time that included electricity, cars, the electric trolley that was being proposed. And they were claiming that they were here seeking a simple and direct relationship with the natural environment. And I think that Mary Ellen Chase is challenging that notion of the rusticators by placing this book deliberately away from MDI, because the reality was that summer residents built an extension of their social and recreational structures from where they were in the off season to up here in Maine. And she wanted to create a boundary between that and the place where she loved. Oh, there we go. And then the last thing I'll just cover really quickly before we dig into some conversation is there's a lot to deal with war and political change. And so Windswept covers 40 years of time, and maybe a little bit longer because we stretch up into the 30s. But there's a lot of political upheaval that happens in the United States in that window of time between 1880 and 1930, including World War I taking place and ending. And the book starts with sort of the beginning stages and the foreshadowing of World War II. And when you think about the fact that she published this book in 1941, she's basing it very truthfully on what is known to be true at the time. We have these massive changes in political and economic and social situations that have taken place over the last 30 years. And then you also have the shadow of war breaking out in Europe that is definitely felt by 1941. And she's referencing that as she ends her book. So at the end, it's interesting. John and Julian have this conversation at the very end of the book and toward the end of their lives, where they're looking back and reflecting on all the different things that have happened and changed over time. They reference the stock market crash, unfettered war debt, really, really high unemployment rates, the threat of communism, the fracturing of America's political party system, and war just ending and about to break out in Europe. And as I was writing that today, I thought of how unbelievably close that mirrors the challenges that we are all reading about in the papers today. And so I thought it was sort of also an interesting time for us to read this book and think about what her characters were experiencing through those similar windows of historic challenge and unprecedented situations like a world war and stock market crash. And so they don't specifically use the term, the progressive movement, or they're not talking about that in exact words, but Julian is resenting sort of the more liberal ideas that the youth are bringing forward, and that he's resenting not being able to have embraced those in his own youth, and then really upset about the fact that his son has been able to embrace them in his. And he calls them half-baked liberals who are down on capitalism. He cites the support of his son for Al Smith, who was the first Catholic to run for president. So something that could have easily slipped through the book, but is really another piece of that place-based setting that she's creating. And then Julian's son is advocating to join the League of Nations and to cancel all of the war debts that were dragging down so much of Europe leading into World War II. And so just a very interesting sort of way to put a transition point towards the end of the book from sort of one era to the next, I think. And she leaves us in this time of transition as she ends the book. And so I think that she really tries to bring Maine into the more national and international political story that's taking place. She could have kept her characters isolated on Windswept, but they go to war, they go overseas, they are not characters apart. So as throwing them sort of into this war, and we suffer the loss of several of them, she's popping the bubble that the Marstons have so carefully tried to create around themselves. And she ends the book with that little prick as it pops, and we don't know what's going to happen as they move forward through this next really unsure phase of Windswept's life. So I'm going to just end where we began, which was with a review from Bess Jones, who, in acknowledging that Chase places the drama to the side, off stage, right? That was sort of the criticism of her review. She says it also allows the novel to be something else. Quote, Windswept thus becomes a symbol of the kind of life America at its wisest can best produce. A tolerant, kind, broad, humorous, humane, strong, humble, in short, a civilized life. So again, thinking of all the things that we are faced with today that are so similar, I really thought that was a powerful way to end my portion of this presentation and open it up for questions and comments and discussion to see what you guys thought of the book and where we were.
Well, I'll jump in. There were so many connections in that book, and you brought up most of what I was thinking too. And so many reminders of other people, other novelists, other writers. Rachel Field came to mind, just that style and time period. And then with respect to the relationship between the year-round and the summer people, I was reminded of Charles Eliot and John Gilly, and how they both respected each other, even though they came from different levels of society and were in different Yeah, the year round versus summer. But the other thing that I was thinking about, as far as family goes, they had a stronger sense of, the Marston family had a stronger sense of place than with some family members. Like, he didn't like that grandmother in Gardner. and that's what struck me, because before we moved here, we lived for 25 years in Gardner, and I could feel that, her description of where the house was, that sense of place. And the grandmother sure didn't have the respect of the summer people that were there. And so there was, the whole family thing was, that just sometimes you have stronger ties with people that you're in a community with than you do with your own family, depending upon your priorities. And the other thing that I loved, because I'm so grateful for your background information on Mary Ellen Chase, because she must have been so well read herself to be talking about Virgil and Homer and Shakespeare and all of the great classical writers. I mean, I took 4 years of Latin, and then again in college. And I was like, man, how do you remember all that? So, and I also think she also had great philosophy she was trying to put forward. There were so many quotes I could have, if I had a pen and pencil when I was reading, I should have written down. There were so many quotes in her dialogue that, yeah, it just was a thinking statement, made me think. And that's what I like most about the book, is that it made me think. So just a few thoughts there.
Yeah, what you said about philosophy, like, her deep dive into, human behavior, I found fascinating. And her style's so different than what's popular now. Like, she will use like 15 descriptive words where a current day author might use 2. You find that like one sentence is like half of the page or whatever. And that's a little bit hard to like get used to that style. But she just, like, some of her insights into human behavior were really interesting to me, and I did mark some. And this is so simple when you think about it, but there's one where they're talking about that grandmother, and how she was like, how dare you defy me, I'm the matriarch, and all that. But it was just one little statement where it says, quivering with angry fear. I guess James Lassiter. Hold on. Bear with me. Angry fear, which she mistook for righteous indignation. So what Mary Ellen Chase is saying is, the grandmother thinks she's righteously indignant, but it's really fear that brings on that that kind of behavior, that sort of bossy matriarchal behavior. And it's like simple, like we know that, but to have it pointed out that way, it's the kind of stuff that makes you go, yeah, she's right. And yeah, I mean, I found a bunch of them that I kind of marked in the book. Like I say, it's stuff it's stuff we know, but who bothers to like find the words for it? Like when you're in an uncomfortable situation with someone, it's uncomfortable, and maybe later you reflect. But like this kind of writing makes me, I hope, remember next time I'm in a conflict, I hope I remember it in the present. I'm aware of it in the present, rather than having to wait till I get home and say, oh shoot, I should have said this or that. Anyway,
I like the relationship reflection between John Marston and Sarah, the housekeeper. after the grandma dies. I thought
Mhm.
that was a really
Yeah, that was,
interesting
yeah.
connection, that of that same sort of like very human, not socially stratified, he's trying to figure out like, why did you stay with this woman who is so horrible to you? And it's like, because it would be a waste of life if I didn't. And it was like, oh, just really powerful.
Yeah, I do remember, I can't even paraphrase, but her statements on grief hit me
Mhm.
personally, that
Right.
I thought was, and there were a couple statements, because there was a lot of death in this book.
Mhm.
And I think Chase kind of, she added what her thoughts were and then left it. It didn't, she didn't dwell on it. It just moved on to another part of the story. But it was well pointed out, her feelings, I think.
I found this book very challenging to read. I really admire Mary Ellen Chase, as well as Rachel Field, who I think is a better writer. But I found it very challenging because, having chosen the point of view that she did, at least for me, there was a distance between for me, between the what the characters were doing, and what the author was doing with them. I felt there was a certain distance, a certain lack of emotional connection to the characters, because she's writing from a point of view that's this omniscient third person voice, where we're hearing Mary Ellen Chase's philosophy, and her the characters are all being staged and performing in certain ways in order to demonstrate the author's philosophy. And that I struggled to connect with this book in any real sense, but I don't think that's necessarily what she was also aiming for. I think she had a very clear plot that she wished to convey. She wished characters to represent certain kinds of people. And her writing is certainly very beautiful in many ways. But I couldn't escape, even though she's from Blue Hill, I couldn't escape this sense of that she was really rather being rather patrician in her portrayal of the characters. And everyone else may completely disagree with that, and I'm interested in what everyone else felt.
Sandy, what did you think her philosophy was?
I think it was.
You said patrician.
Yeah, I think education is clearly very important to her, and I think that there's one particular scene shortly after the I think it was after the second section, where we're beginning in the third section, and John is married to Eileen, and they're at Windswept, and he's talking about the importance of his education in the books, and how you're dead if you can't read great literature and ponder it. And I know that that's his voice speaking, but then it was very interesting, because there's a paragraph or two after that, and she does this quite a few times, where, at least for me, I found it difficult to distinguish between whether this was the character still thinking and what he was thinking, or whether it was her just saying, this is what I believe. And I found that rather jarring, because she's also writing about quote unquote uneducated Down East Mainers, and the Perkins, and and he's kind of thinking about that kind of thing. So what her philosophy? I didn't stop to articulate this in writing, but I would say I think that her philosophy represented the belief in the best principles of what our country and our stands for. The idea that everyone is welcome here. If you work hard, you can get somewhere, or at least, you know, you can live a good, solid life. There's the values of that. And this kind of Thoreau, Emerson sort of train of thought that nature is where you're going to, you retire to nature to be, to find the best things that you'll ever find in the world, in life. But there's virtually nothing in this book that I can point a finger to. Not that there has to be. It is what it is. I embrace that. But there's nothing in this book about how hard it is to live in poverty and struggle. Her characters all somehow are privileged with enough money to buy things and live in these places, and maybe I have gotten somewhat jaded because of reading so much modern fiction. I mean, really, she's writing in a different time. I get that.
Yeah.
But I'm just saying I found it hard to relate to this book.
Well, she's very respectful of those that live in Maine year round. But you're quite right. They seem to be getting along fine on part-time jobs, working for the family. So Caleb somehow is making enough money so that he can survive through the winter when they're gone. And Mrs. Haskell is too. So yeah, they're not fully developed, but on the other hand, I felt that she was very respectful of the people who live in Maine year round.
Sandy, I wondered near the beginning of the book whether she was writing from her own perspective or from a narrator's perspective. And I almost got a little stuck. I told Rainey this already, but there's a passage about in 1871, the immigrants were Germans and Dutch and Scandinavians, decent, cleanly people with the hope of new and free land in their blue eyes, and contrasting that to the noisier, dirtier, more voluble, inflammable Jews and Italians and Greeks and Romanians and Poles and Czechs. And that's the narrator. So I it wasn't one of her characters. And I wondered what you all thought of that. By the way, I actually love the book because I love the way that she clearly paints such vivid pictures of places and characters. But I kind of got stuck as, what's the personality of the narrator?
Yeah.
I felt that it was a very idealized world in many ways, and a very intellectual world. And so there was a disconnect sometimes between emotions and an intellectual exploration of something, and telling a story and describing a beautiful place, which she does so eloquently. But I think she falls down a little bit in the emotional that people have to one another, or that she has to them. And I was very interested to hear Rainey talk about her own life, and I just can't help but wonder that she was sort of out in a very lonely world as a lonely young woman, traveling around, getting sick and getting better, and then coming back to New England and teaching at Smith, and having a Boston marriage, I guess is what we would call it. And how that, and certainly at places like Smith, those were not unusual things to happen, but they were not things that were talked about or necessarily broadly socially accepted. And so I just wonder how all of that plays into her writing.
You know, maybe the narrator doesn't seem emotional. Maybe I don't quite understand. Somebody said something a minute ago about the book not being emotional or the characters not having emotions. I'm not sure. Can you kind of clarify that?
Yeah, I think that was probably me. What I mean is I feel like she consistently tells you as the reader about each character and what they're feeling and what they're thinking, rather than
Showing it.
and then yes, and then moves into another character's
Yeah.
mindset. And there's very little left for the reader to imagine or to put together.
Yeah. Yeah. And I know that one of the things they often say, you know, like writing teachers will say, show, don't tell.
Yeah.
Yeah. Show by the action and whatever the plot, the characters, what they do, rather than tell. And she's definitely telling. But I think for me, that was okay because I felt like she was sort of analyzing human behavior in a lot of ways. And like I said before, just some of the ways, some of her insights into that, like what is the motivation behind how we feel, that was okay with me.
Mhm.
in this case.
Mhm.
I thought the distance that we're all sort of talking about in that book review, which is why I put it in there, mentions it was interesting related to deaths. Like that's where it was the most noticeable for me. I could be okay with like finding distance from political upheaval or the immigration issues, but when the father dies and the brother and the fiance and the mom, we get to the death and then you break away and there's no like, you know, there isn't any of that like full circle. And that's where I think the emotional, Sandy, that's what resonates to me with what you're saying is like is I feel like we're watching from a drone. And so you can see all the actions play out, but you're not embedded or invested in how that feels from the perspective of the person experiencing the loss. And so, it's so, and I mean, this isn't fair because it's not, but it's like almost a little bit cheap where she takes you to that edge of the death and then she hops up 10 years or 5 years. And so,
do you think maybe she's letting us make our own opinions about everything and what we think about death? I don't know. I think the same thing. It happened in each case. She makes a statement, which is sometimes very poignant.
yeah.
And then it's go on to the next chapter and another character.
The exception is with Daniel though, because she does keep us with the boys.
Yeah.
And Jan like helping them through that moment, and like you have to be bonded together, you can't blame Daniel, and then Daniel's not okay for the rest of his life, his short life. And so I feel like that's the one exception, is that we do get to understand the fallout, not necessarily from John's perspective, but a little bit at least from Daniel's.
You know, and in all of her expertise in description and words and language, when you show that picture of Windswept, it is not how I imagined it at all.
I thought I had put a
never
picture of the backside in it.
Did anybody else
No, it doesn't look like
surprised
what I
by
thought.
what it looks like?
No, I thought of a 2-story old clapboard house in my mind.
Oh, wow. I must have totally missed that boat. I mean,
Well, I did too.
I don't know. Maybe I read it too fast. I don't know. I should go back and read it. That's probably what happened.
Yeah.
But that's
No,
not, you know, I was imagining cliffs and, you know, coves, and I mean, he falls off the cliff and dies picking the roses. I mean, I I have to go up to Steuben now. Now
Here.
I'm going to explore.
This was a mistake. I realize now I forgot to put this in the slideshow. This is the other side of Windswept.
So
there's
which
the
side
part-
which side is facing the ocean?
the one that I had shown
Turned
you
around.
see that? Did
Yeah,
you see
yeah.
it? That's the ocean side and that's the back side. So she talks about the two wings of the house coming back and
Mhm.
creating this little courtyard. And this is where they oftentimes would sit, and like Jan and his sister Philomena would sit back here, and at the end of the day, and like sit on the ground, and this is it. So I apologize, I forgot to put that in there, but
No,
it's
no, that's okay. It still
smaller
doesn't
than
look
I
like what I
thought
had
it would
imagined.
be. Yeah, I thought it was huge and this
I
big
did think, I thought it was
rusticator
much
estate.
bigger.
Yeah, no.
Do you know exactly where that is?
We could probably find it. It's on Petite Manan Point in Steuben, and it's
So
listed,
going out
but
to
it
the
is
refuge.
private property. So I don't think you could get all the way out to the property itself. When I was reading on the property, it doesn't, nothing said why she had to sell it in the 50s. I don't know what happened, but she didn't have it for very long, like 12 or 15 years, and then had to sell it. And so then it was like, had subsequent owners had like all her stuff in it, her furnishings, like she wrote a note by hand and left it on the table to the next buyers that I saw a picture of, that's really, like, please love this place as much as I do and cherish all the books and blah, blah, blah. And I guess it was kept essentially like as hers up until the most recent owner, which was very recent, purchased it at auction. No, purchased the house and then had an auction of all the contents.
Oh, man.
Oh,
Like super
Oh.
recently, like within the last
Oh.
2 or 3 years.
Oh,
Yeah. And so there was this blog that I was reading where the writer had gone to the auction and I don't think she knew Mary Ellen Chase, but she knew the history of the house quite well and knew that all the original content were in the house and that its owners, but previously had been caretakers almost to it, but that these new owners were getting rid of it. And so she bought like a table and a lamp or something. And she's telling the story about this auction. And yeah,
Wow.
I was like so heartbroken. It felt so awful. Yeah. And to know that they're buried there, I think is also really interesting, that like how they end up being buried on the property that they don't own. I don't know the details about that either.
Wow.
whoa.
I might have to go exploring.
That's right. Maybe from the water side, take a little dinghy and go from the water side somewhere.
yeah.
Oh, in the winter. And are these summer people that own it?
Chances are good.
Yeah, it's true.
Like a summer place somehow.
Yeah.
So you probably said this, but did she actually have it built, or was it there when she bought it?
She bought it. It was built in the 20s and she bought it in 40.
Yeah.
So it is interesting. She places it architecturally, it doesn't fit the 1880s, but she places it
No.
that way. Yeah.
Yeah.
We had a little bit of time left, like David, Judy, Juanita, Elizabeth, you guys haven't had a chance to chime in. Any thoughts or things you want to share? Oh, David, you're muted.
You're still muted.
There you
I'm
go.
okay now.
Yeah, you're good.
First of all, thanks for your presentation. I would like to read this book again now that I've got the context in such great detail, because I missed some of the points. But I pretty much feel that what I like the book a lot, but the criticism I've heard is I felt while I was reading it, there was a emotional detachment that flipped all the way through it. I say an example of it would be, Jan goes to see the forum in Connecticut where, I'm bad at naming, my mind's going these days.
Anton
Anton is, and doesn't go in. I mean, he just sits back and say, I see it now. It's fine. And that was a lot of what I felt about the book. She has these brilliant, beautiful visual, like they're haikus all the way through it of some scenes. Like I know it's the death of Eileen was, that she's got this purple shawl that she's going to go get. and she dies. And then in the next few pages, the word purple keeps coming up. This is purple, that's purple, that's purple. She sort of paints a word picture of this person's life, but it's not an emotional one. I mean, it was a sad scene, she goes off and plunk, she's dead. And I thought that was sort of what Jan's got, this idealized view of looking at everything is all right. I see this farm from the distance, but I don't go and interact. And so that Dan and the grandmother are outliers, that they actually have some, oomph in them. I mean, the grandmother's horrible, but she does actually fight with somebody. And so you can get an interaction there, which the characters pretty much don't do that. And Adrian too. Adrian ought to have been much more of a wise ass kind of character because she was in real life. But most of it, it's all off. It's all off stage, where the really conflict would work itself out. We don't get to see. We get the philosophy behind it. When someone said this, about 3 people probably already said this. We almost get the Bible version of it. And in fact, I thought that parts of this are like a extended psalm. I said haiku, but maybe psalm was a better version. And those are beautifully written. I have vivid pictures of the horsetail, the sea, and the very ways it look, and the trees at certain points. And I like the book for that. I mean, I could almost just read it and just sort of zone out on those passages. And I don't like conflict personally anyway. And so I would have ducked the conflicts the way she did if I was the writer too. But you really can't do that, right? Well, certainly not in our era. But and I also wonder, if now that I know of the Catholic background, she adds a convent and a positive character is a French nun. And I don't know how that actually, and John and she have this huge relationship, but I don't know that now I don't know how that really fits into the wider social times that she's writing about.
I can't believe I've totally forgot to talk about her.
I forgot that too.
Yeah, the mother.
What an oversight. My background, you don't know this about me, but my background is federal Indian law. And so I spent many, many years studying federal Indian relations, and so the boarding school era is a huge part of that. And so the nun character came in, and my instinct as somebody who's a native scholar was like, oh God, beatings, it's going to be horrible, they're going to be repressive, it's going to be, and then she's so lovely and funny, and I was like, I don't think I've ever read a nun. It's like,
oh, I had plenty.
That was a first for me. She kept me nervous the whole book. I don't know if I can like this woman, but that's a good point, David. Is like this very like wise, kind, accepting figure, a Catholic figure, who's not American. She's in Canada, so I don't know if there's something to be said for that too. But other thoughts.
Well, they never tell the daughter her true story.
No, you don't know.
I mean, they whitewash it, excuse me. And, her father died in Europe, as we hope he did. And the mother died in childbirth. But, it was, what was, I think there was a lack of honesty about emotions and so on.
Yeah, that was the nun's one moment where she got out of her saintly role when the Adrian died. She did seem really concerned about not letting anyone know what happened in the convent. And so she did sort of a little bit of a cover up, which that struck me as like, she's not been like this all the way through the book.
Well, I like the fact that she would read novels, while she secretly, because that's what she really wanted to do. I don't know. It gave nuns kind of a personality and a humanity that, my mom would say they're human too.
Yeah, I had a great aunt that was a nun, and I actually only met her a few times, but Yeah, it didn't seem far-fetched to me that this nun had a human side, because I'd seen that in life.
Right, right.
Has
Yeah.
anybody read anything else that she has written? Marilyn,
Yes.
it made me curious to read some of her other works.
Yes, I've read Silas Crockett, which was published in 1935. And to me, it's an extremely different book, very emotional, a very wonderful book, very complete, about the several generations of sailors and captains in the same family. And so it really helps me to understand that I think that Mary Ellen Chase was trying to do something really different with this book than Silas Crockett, and which I really admire. I think she was reaching far to try to write about broader, I shouldn't say broader themes, because all the themes, rich themes, are in Silas Crockett, but she was reaching to incorporate more of the politics, as you said, Rainey, and the temperature of the actual times, where Silas Crockett is all set back in the 19th century. So I think she was trying to do something very, very different with this book. And sometimes authors who are wonderful authors don't necessarily succeed every time, because they're reaching and they're experimenting. I think these are the only two I've read by her, but I would highly recommend Silas Crockett to all of you if you haven't read it. It's
Sandy, is that also in Maine, set in Maine?
Yes, on the coast of Maine, right nearby, right near our area.
Oh, okay.
But this was a very well accepted, and I mean, how many printings? I mean, this was one of her more
Yeah.
successful books.
Yeah,
Yes.
it
Yeah.
must have really struck a chord at the time.
Yes.
Yeah.
Elizabeth, you turned your camera on. Did you have something you want to add?
Well, I don't know if I can express myself, but I'll try. What I loved about this book was, I think what you're referring to as the offstage pieces of it, of action. I mean, about the boy dying, falling off the cliff. I mean, she never says he falls off the cliff and dies. She says, she describes the weather, the flowers, the cliff, the distance. And then the next thing you know, you're on to something else. And I found myself, what? What?
Yeah.
I found this kind of restraint very refreshing. These authors are people, I mean, go into the action, the details, the event, what happened. She never, she leaves that up to you to figure out. And I love that. I found it so refreshing. And that wasn't the only part like that. I mean, and she kept doing that again and again. And I love that.
Nice. All right. Any last observations or thoughts?